BBC Essex.
One of the other things we're talking about on Breakfast, one of our main stories today, also relates to driving, but more specifically, parking. We are talking about private parking firms today and some of the fines and charges that you may end up getting. What has happened to you on this front? Did you get something that you disputed that you felt was unfair? Did you manage to successfully challenge it? Well, as you've been hearing in the news with Smithy, there's a small change coming in today to the sector's own code of practice. And this is aimed at making things a little bit fairer if you can't pay to park within the first few minutes of parking up your vehicle. You might remember this case from a little while back. This was a woman in Derby taken to court for almost £2,000 after struggling to pay for her parking on her phone. She couldn't get a signal, basically. So she was trying to pay. She was struggling to get a signal. She ended up getting fined quite a lot. She was trying to challenge it. In the end, the case was dropped, and it has prompted this change, so you won't be charged if you're struggling to pay in the first few minutes, as this particular woman from Derby did. Well, I spoke to Tom Ellison from Chelmsford a bit earlier on in the show. He was telling me he feels the changes don't go far enough. This is after he was forced to pay a fine of £170 a little while back. This is what happened to Tom.
I parked in a car park in Chelmsford owned by Euro Car Parks. It was Saturday, little after 8 p.m. The machine said out of service, and so I had no way of paying. Checked the sign, and it didn't say there was a charge. At the time, it said Monday to Friday there was a charge after 8 p.m. It was £2, but there was nothing on there for Saturday. So I thought I'd better take a picture of the machine and the sign, and then I got a ticket saying that I need to pay because I've been fined for this. So I disputed that charge. Said to them that the sign doesn't say I need to pay. Then they said I need to pay £170 for that, which I thought was insane. It's 85 times the original fee. And then, to top it all off, I went back to that car park a few weeks later, and they had replaced the sign with a new one that now said you do have to pay after 8 p.m. on a Saturday. So I feel like they used my money to replace the sign.
Well, that was Tom telling us about an incident that happened to him a little while back. We did approach Euro Car Parks, the car park in question here, but we haven't heard back from them this morning. Slightly different scenario that led to him getting a fine. But overall, he was saying more regulation needed to protect consumers.
I was in financial services for quite a number of years, heavily regulated by Financial Conduct Authority. We could only charge a percentage of a contract value as a fine. And these can charge like 85 times more than the original value of the ticket, and even more in those cases. So, I think there needs to be regulators that can monitor this and protect the consumer, ultimately.
Some of your comments that have been coming in already this morning were saying that very thing, that there is this code of practice that the private car park operators sign up to. It's essentially their own code of practice, and they're essentially marking their own homework. Some people saying that's not really strong enough. It needs to come from government. This is something the government have looked at doing and were set to introduce a few years ago. Haven't as yet, but it is something they are insisting they are going to do. We brought you a statement earlier from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government saying motorists have got to be protected when using private car parks. We're determined to drive up standards in the industry. We know how much of an issue this is for drivers, which is why we'll set out further details on the private parking code of practice as soon as possible. So this isn't related to your sort of council, public land, council-owned car parks, but your private car parks. Have you had a run-in with any of those, and how did it play out? Let me know. I've got Scott Dixon with me now on BBC Essex. Scott runs the Complaints Resolver website, wrote the book How to Complain. What do you think about this slight tweak then to this code of practice? Scott, good morning to you.
Good morning, Sonia. Essentially, I consider it to be smoke and mirrors, because the trade association, the CEO, Will Hurley, he was on BBC Breakfast last Wednesday, and what he said is you won't get a parking charge notice if you pay for the time spent in the car park, and they've put in a panel and safeguards and mechanisms to ensure that you don't get penalised if you fail to find a space and leave, and if you pay for parking when you're in the car park. But essentially, he couldn't explain how this safeguard works, and there are no mechanisms in place because you've got an ANPR camera when you enter the car park, which starts the clock, and then you've got an ANPR camera at the exit, which stops the clock. And if you drive around a car park, can't find a space, and you're stuck in traffic in a busy car park, you're still likely to be hit with a parking charge notice for up to £100. And it doesn't go far enough to protect drivers when you factor in the various problems motorists encounter with car parks. For example, downloading the app, entering the parking detail, setting up an account, approving online banking verification, making a payment. All these things you can easily run into maybe 10 minutes or more. Yeah. So I don't think it goes far enough.
What would solve this? Because MPs, and there is potentially something coming down the track, goodness knows when, but the government's saying they are going to set something up themselves. What do you think would solve this? Because MPs have spoken before in the last few years about the fact that it varies quite a lot. It can seem like a bit of a Wild West, can't it? And as you said, it's very easy for you to potentially get a fine and then get repeatedly hassled about that.
Yeah, well, the first thing to stress is it's not a fine, Sonia. It's simply an invoice for an alleged breach of contract for parking on private land, which looks like a fine. Only councils can fine you, and they issue penalty charge notices, whereas private parking operators they issue parking charge notices, and they look the same. And in Tom's case, for example, he paid £170, but that was on the back of a debt collector letter. Yeah. And these third-party debt collectors, they have no powers to enforce the alleged debts owed to the private parking operators. And nobody knows this, but they're classed as strangers to the debt, and they don't have any powers whatsoever to enforce it. All they do is they issue legalese jargon, red lettering, and threatening letters that imply that you're going to be taken to court and you're going to be hit with a county court judgment if you lose your case in court. You can ignore all these begging letters, but what you need to watch out for is the letter before claim, which is the last stop before it goes to court. And if you lodge a robust defence on a letter before claim, more often than not, these cases are dropped before they go to court.
And what are some of the things that might get that struck out then? Is it to do with making sure there's signage and it's clear? What are some of the obvious things that you could dispute and win?
Well, the signage is a big one, and in Tom's case, it was a slam dunk, and the industry is simply doing what should never have been in place originally. And the Consumer Rights Act 2015 protects you here because the Consumer Rights Act 2015 has a fairness test, and this 5-minute rule that's allegedly being cancelled and abolished, it could be seen as an unfair contract term under Section 62 of the Consumer Rights Act 2015, and that requires terms to be fair and transparent, and that applies to signage generally in car parks. And if a term is unfair, it's not binding. And this may apply to the arbitrary timeframes set by the parking companies previously. And also, if you're struggling to make the payment in time for a variety of reasons, a busy car park, you're having trouble downloading the app, you can't find a space, you're stuck in traffic. All these factors can be taken into account to lodge a robust defence. And on the run-up to Christmas, for example, I was on BBC Local Radio speaking about motorists stuck in busy car parks, and they couldn't get past the exit ANPR camera in time, and they were hit with parking charge notices. In that scenario, the contract was frustrated by impossibility, and you need to push hard. And generally, the first appeals are usually rejected because that's part of the business model. But if you escalate it to the second stage with the British Parking Association, Poplar, that's the second stage appeal, usually 40% are upheld. Yeah. And that evidences my suspicions that it's just a percentages game that they play.
Yeah, a lot of people, as you said, find some of those letters quite intimidating, and they feel like they're not going to be successful, so they get put off the whole process. And a lot of people will be listening to this and thinking, the introduction of these, the cameras, the readiness to fine, all that sort of stuff. It's, a lot of people will think this is just a money-making exercise, isn't it?
It is. And the ANPR cameras don't take into account mitigating circumstances and problems that motorists face. And there are no mechanisms in place. And even Will Hurley, the CEO of the International Parking Community last Wednesday, he couldn't really explain the safeguards either. And essentially, it's just smoke and mirrors. And what we do need is a UK government code of practice. And that was withdrawn in June 2022 because the Trading Association, the British Parking Association and the International Parking Community, they challenged it. They launched a legal challenge because the UK government code of practice would cap the parking charge notice fees, and it would ban debt recovery fees. And that reflects the industry's resistance to real change. And the UK government code of practice would have fairer measures in place to protect motorists and create a level playing field. And as I say, I think we need to ban these third-party debt collectors because they use intimidation and aggressive tactics, and they have no powers to enforce these alleged debts. And it is a money-making racket. They are strangers to the debt, and Tom could have safely ignored those letters and let it go to court and let a district judge decide.
Well, Scott, thank you. Fascinating to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. Scott Dixon, who runs the Complaints Resolver website. He's also written a book called How to Complain, saying this tweak, not fining you if you can't pay for your parking straight away because maybe you've got problems trying to access the app or you haven't got any signal on your phone. So it's quite unfair to then slap you with a fine. They're eradicating that, but Scott's saying it's all a bit smoke and mirrors in his view anyway. And there is this code of conduct, and that's what's being tweaked, this sort of code of practice, but it's essentially set up, monitored by the private parking operators themselves. So they're kind of, as we mentioned earlier, marking their own homework. And as Scott was saying, there has been talk of the government bringing in a code of practice, but that hasn't gone through yet. There was a little bit of resistance from the private parking operators, hasn't gone through yet, but that government statement I mentioned a little while ago suggests they still want to pursue it. Is that the only way to really safeguard motorists as best you can so you don't find yourselves getting some of these fines unnecessarily? What's been your experience? Have you been fined for something that you felt was a little bit harsh or unfair? Did you try and appeal that? And were you successful? 0800 111 40 41, my number. You can drop us a text or a WhatsApp as well if you prefer to get involved that way.